Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Sim Racing Rejects podcast. My name is Ted Hough and I'm joined by Austin Ogonoski as always. This is the only podcast scientifically proven to end post-World War I German economic hyperinflation. Today we're talking about a little bit more positive of a topic, bringing it back around from our more negative or controversial or critical topic last time, and today we're going to be giving some advice. We're going to be talking about mistakes we see new sim racers make, how to avoid them, and what we maybe would have preferred to have done differently when we first got into sim racing.
Yeah, this is a really fun topic to cover because let's be honest, sim racing is hard, full stop, and getting into the hobby can sometimes take years before you start to see any fruits of your labor, really, because just getting around the track without wrecking usually ends up being a lot more difficult of a task than most people anticipate when they first get into this stuff. But there are ways that we've found just over the years and in talking with some of our friends who are also, pretty respected sim racers, where you can alleviate a lot of that learning process and actually get up to speed a lot quicker and actually start having fun with these games. And it makes for just, an enjoyable hobby overall because you're not constantly suffering. Especially when I was growing up, I remember my first time playing Grand Prix Legends, the demo of it, because, back in the day we had demos of games. I think it was just like the Lotus 49 around Watkins Glen. And it was incredible to me how much effort it took just to get around the track, let alone doing a race against the AI. And I know that even, in today's day and age where we have like decently modern wheels that you can go to Memory Express and buy, a lot of people still struggle with that same scenario without, just playing it on a keyboard. But, having gone through that whole process ourselves, we can now kind of coach people through a lot of the pitfalls that happen when you try and really get into this hobby hardcore. And it can actually be fun for you in just a matter of, a couple weeks or months. But there's some stuff you really have to abide by to get the most out of it. Yeah, and a lot of the errors these people make when they dive headfirst into sim racing and find that, whoa, this is actually really quite difficult, and I'm not having a lot of fun, and I'm just spinning out all the time. Sometimes these errors start before they even purchase their first racing sim. I know with Assetto Corsa being on sale, sometimes for as low as like $5 or $8. Like it gets stupid low at some points. People will jump in, and within a day or two, they're like, I really don't get it. The first mistake a lot of these guys make is that they try and jump into sims right away. In talking with a lot of my my buddies that I've grown up sim racing with, basically since I was a teenager, and now we're almost in our 30s, a lot of us didn't jump into simulators just on a whim. A lot of us grew up playing various types of racing games, and we were kind of eased into the world of racing sims. So like when I was growing up, like I was a teenager in the early 2000s, so like, as a 12-year-old, I'm playing NFS Underground, I'm playing NFS Hot Pursuit 2, I'm playing stuff like Burnout 3, and like obviously these games aren't realistic. They have hyper gripped up tires, they have brake to drift mechanics like Burnout's canned drifting animation. But what a lot of these games teach you is stuff that in racing schools they have to teach you like through a proper course. Stuff like racing lines, stuff like where you should be braking for a corner, even though it's not super realistic in a game like Need for Speed or Burnout or whatever you're playing. You could even throw in games like Driver or GTA into that mix. A lot of the stuff that these games teach you, it's subconsciously wiring you to think from a racer's perspective, just in a very kid-friendly and easygoing environment. So you start building a lot of half-decent fundamentals by playing what are, for all intents and purposes, arcade racers. And then again, in talking with my friends, most of us didn't go, okay, we've mastered NFS, we've mastered, Burnout. We then moved on, not to a hardcore racing sim on the PC, but then we also went and picked up the Gran Turismo games, or the Forza Motorsport games, depending on which console you owned. And those games, again, they still weren't super realistic, but they eased you along that path almost like a feeder series. You could say that games like Need for Speed and GT are basically the feeder series into sim racing, where it slowly takes the kid gloves off. In games like GT and Forza, you can disable driver assist, but the tire model is still slightly more forgiving than a hardcore racing sim. And spending a few years with those games and blasting around on Xbox Live with your buddies and running, fake little leagues where you do, a 5-lap race and that seems really long for you, that's actually a really good environment to learn in and to kind of learn the tracks that you'll be visiting in racing sims, to kind of, grasp the idea of, hey, like, you can use those braking boards on the side of the track as your brake reference points. You don't need to drive with the driving line on. Stuff like that I almost see the progression from arcade racers to full-on sims as a multi-year, almost academy-style process. So when I finally did dive headfirst into sims, I think I did this in 2010 when I was 17 or 18 years old, it felt like I already had a lot of the fundamentals down, and the cars were just a touch harder to drive, as opposed to having, jumped into the deep end of the pool, not knowing how to swim or tread water. And I think that's an issue a lot of people have with sim racing, is because, especially with the COVID lockdowns, sim racing kind of went viral in a lot of ways. You would see like your favorite racing series post videos of, let's say, the NASCAR guys all doing the iRacing series, and instead of guys being like, yeah, like I'll check out a NASCAR console game, a lot of like casual fans who probably weren't ready for the level of depth the sim offers immediately went out and purchased iRacing, or they went out and purchased a wheel and Assetto Corsa, and realized that maybe that wasn't the best idea. Do you kind of agree, or is there like what kind of progression did you follow when you first got into this stuff?
For me, it was kind of like, that's actually a really good question. So for me, it was crappy arcade racing games and just liking race cars on TV and thinking they were cool when I was a little boy. And then that turned into Crash Team Racing for the PS1. And then that turned into, when we finally got a PS2 and I got a hand-me-down PS2, it turned into some arcade games and some Simcade games. So it was kind of Crash Team Racing and Arcade Racers on the PS1, and then Rallycross for the PS1, which is actually a super fun arcade racer rally game.
Here's a good question. Do you remember the exact moment you got good at those games and you're like, okay, I need something else?
No, nothing specific. I don't remember a moment. It was just, these were the games I played during my childhood, and there was no specific indicator of, I'm ready for this. And that's a mistake I think a lot of people make, is they think, I'm going to jump into a simulator and I don't even like racing games, right? Especially over COVID, because this is a hobbyist thing, right? It's the thing a lot of people get into as a hobby, right?
Yeah, I've seen that too.
Right. I think that it's perfectly acceptable if you don't want to spend a lot of money on professional coaching like you would for real life driving before you ever get in a car, or like you do with flying. If you don't want to do 200, 300, 400 hours of classroom instruction before you jump on a racing simulator, you can reduce the amount of time you need to put in and also increase your enjoyment by weaning yourself through some arcade games first. So for me, it went Crash Team Racing and Rallycross for the PS1 to Need for Speed Underground for the PS2, and then Need for Speed Underground 2, and then Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, which is kind of a little bit more realistic than the tire model from the Underground games.
I didn't think it was that bad. I mean, I've been playing it on a PS2 emulator, and like the tires are gripped up. I mean, we make no mistake about stating the obvious. But like your basic driving mechanics like weren't terrible. Like you still had to brake and point the nose into the apex of the corner, and it felt kind of okay. Fundamentals
were fine, and it will teach you fundamentals even if it's a little bit over forgiving. But a lot of people run into that problem. I notice in a coaching environment with GT3 and GT4 cars and the rookie cars on iRacing all being cars with anti-lock brakes, basically holding their hand and them getting into bad habits on the sim that they would get if they were in an arcade racer anyway. So it's almost kind of a moot point.
Okay.
And then I went from those games, from the Need for Speed games, onto Gran Turismo 4 and Suzuki TT Superbikes, the Simcade Isle of Man and English road racing bike racing game. And then on PS3 onto kind of like GT5. And then in, I think it was 2011 when I was 13 years old, I got iRacing for the first time. And there was no specific point at which it was like, okay, well, I'm ready to move on from these games. And when I was younger, I was not anywhere near the caliber of driver I am now. I had to learn over a very long period of time. And for me, going to real-life racing schools and getting my actual racing licenses helped me a lot. One thing that helped a ton was the driver school sections in Gran Turismo 4 and actually reading the text for the car control drills, right? Because they based that on real life racing coaching that they got from, Ross Bentley and the Porsche Performance Experience Centers and all that kind of stuff. So There's nothing wrong with using an arcade or simcade game to give yourself good fundamentals to then move on to a simulator. But jumping straight into a simulator that's simulating full-blown realism and as punishing as it gets with no either technical background, knowledge, or experience, I would argue might be a mistake or a little bit foolhardy. As a professional driving coach, a lot of my time when we use simulation software, specifically drivers that don't have real-life racing experience and just are sim drivers and want sim-only coaching, a lot of my time is working people back from misconceptions that they've developed from bad internet sources, watching YouTube videos of, XXX underscore dog lover XXX making a racing school thing on the internet for Assetto Corsa or whatever, right? A lot of my time is spent building drivers down from misconceptions learned from people who jump onto the simulator too quickly without any arcade racing experience, any real-life racing experience, or any background theory knowledge. So I think doing that front work can be really important and also really fun. If you can't find anybody to race against because sim racing is so niche, why not just race on Forza or Gran Turismo instead, where you can find more racing more easily?
Yeah, and I noticed that too back in the day. It was really easy to find just any sort of public lobby or like a group of guys running the same cars night after night on Forza that wanted to hold like moderately long races. If you enjoy the kind of brand of racing that some of those games offer, by all means go for it, because sim racing you'll learn very quickly. There is not the user base that you have in Call of Duty or Battlefield or Halo where you can jump on, at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. And there, within seconds, you have a full field of guys for like SWAT or like, oddball or something like that. Sim racing, it's really close to like Rec League Soccer, and I've said that for years now, where like there are dedicated, hotspots and dedicated times for all the races to go off with a moderately full field. And if you try and play the games outside of those times, you'll find absolutely nobody. So like if Forza offers a full field of guys to race with, or some sort of online ecosystem that isn't super hardcore, but there's people to race with and they kind of give a shit about the game, I would do it anyway just for the track time and the experience, especially if you're young and you're relatively new in the hobby. You need those reps of just driving in a pack and understanding what people do when they're in the heat of the moment. And just the sheer volume and the repetition of driving in that pack is really important, because otherwise you'll never figure out how to survive like turn 1 at Monza or some of the bigger clusterfucks in sim racing if you don't subject yourself to them. So that's a pretty good point you brought up. But you brought up another interesting concept about there being a lot of misinformation online, and dear God, this is something I wish that I would have known a lot sooner in like my journey through sim racing. But the amount of pure crap on the forums is like really impressive. I mean, I don't want to name like any one website because like they're all pretty equally bad, but I noticed like there's a massive discrepancy in like the advice given on like the sim racing subreddit that has like 30, 40, 50,000 people. It might even be more. And just like the pure shit that I would read in the forums like didn't even remotely match what was actually good purchasing or buying advice. Like a couple examples, in my opinion, the Formula 1 series by Codemasters is actually really, really good. Each game has its own little handling quirks, and the tires handle a bit differently in each game. But anytime I've jumped into Cody's F1 stuff, that's generally what a rubber tire feels like, and I've been quick in those games. Like I was very close to qualifying for like the F1 esports competition back in 2017. I think like you needed to make the top 33 for one of the challenges, and I had a time that was like 37th because it was just that close. And I would go on to Reddit and I would see anytime the game was mentioned in just like random, hey, is the F1 series any good? I'm looking to pick it up on sale. There would just be like a wave of angry sim racers being like, no, it's a piece of shit arcade game, you should avoid it. When in reality, no, that game's actually pretty fucking good. I also saw the inverse happen, both with Automobilista 2, and I think there was one other game, might have been just both Automobilista games, where people would say, hey, like these games by Reza Studios are phenomenal, they're fantastic, they're really underrated, and you'd see, again, 20, 30, 40 replies in a thread encouraging people to buy those games and how great they handled, and then you would buy them and go online, and you'd check Steam charts and there were 30 people playing them worldwide, or something ridiculous like that. And then you'd go in their own official forums, and people would be whining that like half the cars in the game were broken, or like an update borked the game, and people were raging that like it felt unfinished and just lacked polish. Oh, the other game was R Factor 2. So you'd have like people on the forums just shilling the fuck out of games that like nobody actually played. So if you were someone who was new to the hobby and didn't know a lot of stuff, you know, in regards to like the different politics surrounding each game and the different levels of fanaticism, you would be totally misled about which sim to get.
I think this thought can basically be truncated into be wary of people in a hobbyist circle being all in on what they like and all in on what they dislike, because it might not be accurate, okay? When you're on the internet and you're like, hey, I'm thinking of maybe moving from arcade racing to sim racing or blah, 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 you're going to get people like, don't touch this is trash, it fucking sucks, it's awful, it fingered my cat to death, blah, 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 about a software that might just be fine, and you'll get people being horrible, oh my god, this thing is so wondrous and glorious, and it made my wee-wee 5 inches longer, and they could be shilling something that sucks, right? Nobody is immune to propaganda, and all simulation software run marketing campaigns. They want to sell software. These companies want to sell software, and nobody's immune to that, right? The media runs stories on different race car drivers, and it gives people certain impressions about those race car drivers' personalities. Then why wouldn't you think fans could then also still be susceptible to thinking certain softwares are better than others and being wrong about that? One source that I really recommend to go to check this, because he says it a lot more intelligently than I think me or Austin can. There's a video by a guy who runs an extremely high quality handmade simulation hardware company, called Niels Hissingfold. He's a European guy, and he has a video called "Don't Give Up on Sim Racing If You Don't Like iRacing." But the video isn't specifically about iRacing. Basically, it's about the fact that in his opinion, most simulation softwares are roughly equivalent, and as long as you find something that works for you, you should use that, and you should ignore people telling you what's the best or the worst simulation software, and use what you like. Just do that. I think that's a perfectly appropriate way of thinking about sim racing, because frankly, for my professional background, I have come to the point where I understand they all have problems. They all have things they're good at and bad at, and they're on a spectrum of realism. If one sim is 99.5% accurate and the other's 98.5% accurate, but you prefer playing the one that's 98.5% accurate, don't let somebody tell you that it's not worth using, and just use it if you want to.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point with the Niels video, because he made that video in response to the COVID pandemic and how a lot of people were jumping headfirst into iRacing, like we talked about earlier, and finding that the game was actually really difficult and almost overly difficult, which has been a common complaint of iRacing with the tires. Once they get past the peak slip curve, the car will just instantly wreck. It's been a common complaint of just pro drivers everywhere. Yet you will see a lot of people in the forums, and again, this kind of circles back to our point about staying away from Reddit and other just online communities where there's a lot of like shilling and just fanaticism. You'll see hundreds of comments being like, if you want to get into sim racing, iRacing is your only option. Those kind of people paint a really misleading picture about just like the world of sim racing, which can be really tough to digest if you're someone completely brand new to the hobby and just doesn't know anything about the ecosystem and any of like the politics involved. So yeah, like unless you find your information from a really reputable source like Niels Hissingfeld, I would just ignore almost all of it and just play what works for you. Don't be suckered into just listening to the community, because the community is full of both fanatics and actual viral marketing and shilling. And that can really mess up, especially if you don't have a lot of money to spend on these games, you don't have a lot of time, and you find that driving isn't really coming natural to you and you have to work at it. This can really mess up your path through sim racing, because you'll be spending a lot of time on games that you just don't click with and you don't get, and you don't understand why you're not clicking with them.
No point doing it if we don't like it, I think.
Yeah, I think that's just the overall sentiment here, is that, like, hey man, if you find a racing sim that you like, even if it, doesn't have a lot of people playing it, not the worst idea to just stick with it, because once you start getting roped into a lot of the fanboyism that has infected sim racing over the past, I would say, 10 years, because it's definitely a newer thing. Stick with it. Don't get lured into purchasing games that you're really not interested in just because the hive mind told you to, because there can be a lot of nefarious things at play. Now, once you're actually in the game, let's say you picked up Assetto Corsa. One of the biggest mistakes people make is that they are so overwhelmed by choices in car selection that it's actually hard for them to kind of pick one car and stick with it. You'll see, especially when you buy AC, let's say you just get vanilla AC with all the DLC packs, because it's usually on sale for a couple bucks. You get almost 200 cars to pick from, and they span basically the complete history of auto racing from 1950 to present day. And it's only natural because there's nothing locked like there is in Forza, where you're restricted to driving your entry-level cars until you can afford to buy new ones and stuff like that. Because there's so much choice and it's just all there for you right away, a lot of people will make the mistake of just trying to drive everything all at once. Like, they'll boot up AC and one night drive the 787B, and then another night drive the Formula 1 car, and then, another night drive a DTM car from the 90s, and they'll suck at all of them. There's a reason for this. A lot of these cars for newcomers are actually quite difficult to drive. And a lot of people don't understand that, like, hey, just because there are cars on the car roster, you almost have to curate the experience for yourself and force yourself to start in a slower, more predictable either street car or an entry-level race car, just so you can get the basics down. A lot of people don't do this, and you'll see this time and time again in public servers. The majority of new people just hanging out in a public server or trying to race with their friends don't restrict themselves to what their skill level should be, and will find themselves way in over their heads trying to drive a car they're just not ready for. But the best thing you can probably do to yourself, and you'll probably agree with me here and be able to elaborate a bit with your coaching stuff, is to really find one or two cars. And even if you're not like a fan of like the BMW M235i racing because you don't like BMWs, or you're not a fan of like Porsche Carreras because you just don't like the look of them, find one car. Drive that car for 2 or 3 weeks, where that's the only car you drive, and you use that car to help yourself learn all the different tracks in the game, because it's a lot like skating. It's a lot like getting decent at one particular sport. You get to refine that particular skill set for that car and actually build yourself some confidence. Otherwise, you'll just find yourself really, really struggling, because you're just shopping around and trying everything and not dialing in any of your fundamentals.
One of the problems a lot of drivers have with sim racing that I see consistently in all the simulator racing coaching that I do online, and even with our real life students who do more sim racing than they do real life racing, or who have more money than brains, to be blunt, is people love trying new cars, doing new things, and there's people who identify with the building and tuning aspect of driving and racing more so than they do the actual art of performance driving, right? So this is your friend who built a V8 swapped Porsche 944 and then sold it for a Fox body Mustang, and then got a turbo Honda Civic Si that he built a big motor on, and blah, blah, blah. Your car swapper friend, right? There's people who do this in real life racing as well, and there's people who do this in sim racing. I apologize if this offends you, but no matter who you are not good enough to drive an F1 car in a racing simulator with zero driving experience. You are not good enough to drive a Group C sports car. You are not good enough to drive the Lotus 49. You are not good enough to drive a GT3 car with absolutely zero driving experience. It takes real-life drivers 3, 5, 10 years to get to their first semi-pro series after they ride for the first time or drive for the first time, right? I'm looking at getting my motorcycle racing license next year, and I literally have to go to street riding school. The series liaisons told me this. I have to go to street riding school, go to a defensive riding course for bikes and a skills course, and get a couple hundred miles on a bike before they even let me go to a track day, and then do a couple of those before they let me at racing school. And I've been racing for 10 years, and that's a requirement of me, right? You are not going to be able to go from an arcade racer to a simulation of real life that's meant to be used as a training tool, or jump in a real life car with zero experience and drive one of the fastest race cars that was ever driven. I understand people love the Formula 2004 and the Mazda 787B and all the Turbo Nissan Skyline Japanese Touring Car Championship cars. And it's really, really crappy to have to swallow your pride and do this. But my recommendation for new drivers is get as fast as possible. Put your first 5 to 10 hours of the game into the slowest car available. Or if there's a specific car that you get as like your beginner car in that sim, just drive that one until you know how to perfectly make a 20-minute race without crashing or going off or having any problems, and then slowly start ramping it up if you want to. Real-life race car drivers sometimes drive something like an EG Honda Civic hatchback, or an old Honda Integra, or a Porsche 944, or a Mazda Miata their whole racing career for 20 or 30 or 40 years, and become professional level drivers by mastering the art of retaining energy. Driving a race car is a lot like fighting in a fighter aircraft, to make a connection to the aviation part of my background, right? It's about going as fast as possible, aka slowing down as little as possible. And those slower cars with a lot more grip but a lot less power punish every tiny little mistake you can possibly make, because in a car with only 100 horsepower, you can't fix that corner once you've missed that braking point. If you slide a little bit wide and cause some understeer and lose that inertia, you're not getting it back, right? So the newer cars are punishing in such a way that they teach you how to drive better, when the faster cars are punishing in such a way that they're just going to be frustrating and make you want to quit, because you can't keep the car on the racetrack if it has 1,000 horsepower. But if you're in a tiny car with 100 horsepower and you make the same mistake, instead of spinning out and destroying the car against the wall, you'll just lose half a second or 2 seconds of lap times. So it'll make a mistake that you can then learn from, rather than a mistake that's so punishing you don't have time to learn anything from it. And I think that's incredibly valuable.
You actually bring up a really good point comparing this to real life. Like, I've seen this at the oval racing level, which, I mean, it happens a lot with guys swapping classes just because cars are pretty cheap. So, you can trade, a mini stock for a late model or a sprint car, with not pocket change, but close to pocket change. And you'll see some guys who are pretty dominant in one class jump up a class or two, and they're just completely in over their heads, because it's just, there's so much technique and finesse required to drive high horsepower stuff that unless your driving fundamentals are absolutely polished to a T, that jumping ahead a few classes is really, really difficult. And even coming down a few classes, like, I mean, I think I mentioned this last podcast, but like, we ran a mini stock race with a couple of late model drivers who thought they could drive a 200 horsepower Fox body like a late model and all wrecked in the same corner, because it was just so fundamentally different, and they weren't ready for that giant jump, even though it was a step downwards. So I think you bring up a good point where that, like, these cars in real life, when you try and drive a GT3 car or an F1 car or an Indy car in real life, these cars are reserved for the best of the best, because they're that fast and that punishing when your fundamentals aren't dialed in. So in a sim, that's going to be replicated to some extent, and that's why guys like you and I can just rocket around in like an Indy car and it looks easy, but other people struggle and are 5, 6, 7 seconds off pace, and they wonder what the fuck we did, because no, like, that's just how this stuff works. The fast cars, even though they're cool in Gran Turismo to own and they make you feel like Superman when you're driving them, once you kind of get to the unshackled, playground of a racing sim, your lack of fundamentals, it's kind of like a butterfly effect, where it'll only become more and more pronounced. So again, you might want to drive the 787B. Probably not the best idea to do it right off the bat. It's probably worth, curating yourself into the slower stuff, or even just like mid-range stuff. Like GT4 seems to be a pretty decent starting place if the idea of spec Miata or or like a front wheel drive. What's that, like that Fiat 500 Abarth and AC?
Yeah, the Fiat 500 Abarth is a great beginner car. If you're in a simulation software that has a front wheel drive cup car, like a little Fiat Punto cup car or a Ford Ka cup car or a Renault Clio, spending a couple hours on that would be great. If you really, really can't stomach that, the absolute fastest thing I would recommend for a complete beginner to drive would be like a BMW 1-make cup car, like the 325i that's in iRacing and Assetto. I would say avoid anything that is heavier than 3,500 pounds and has more than 300 horsepower for a first car to learn on, whether front or rear wheel drive.
One of the issues that arises is that a lot of these games aren't curated. Like when you boot up Race Room Racing Experience, when you boot up AC, when you boot up R Factor 2, they don't, there's no career mode. There's no mode that says, okay, like here's one of 3 starter cars you can pick from. We're going to lock GT3 behind like 15 to 20 hours of gameplay, if that makes sense, right? That's something that a lot of racing sims just don't have. Even stuff like P-Cars 2, where there is a single-player campaign mode, you're not forced to learn the ropes before you start, accessing the high horsepower stuff. So a lot of people tend to treat these games like a sandbox, and that's probably the worst thing they can do. Even iRacing to some extent, with the way their class system works, and because there's such an aggressive license promotion system, it's very easy to find yourself in high horsepower cars when you're not ready for it. But overall, most racing sims don't kind of gate off some of the more intense content for talented drivers. It's just all readily available for you to access right off the bat. And that really messes with a lot of people's perceptions of what they're able to drive. Because I think psychologically people just boot up, like, let's say AC for the first time or R Factor 2 for the first time, and they're like, oh, there's an Indy car in this game, I'm going to try driving that. And they really don't understand that, like, no, like, this is really not the car for you right now. There's no progression system to, like, gate it away and say, like, okay, you're ready for this. So people just dive in and they're like, wow, I kind of suck at this and this isn't fun. A lot of this is happening. And I think that's on the devs to some extent to be like, hey, like, let's actually make people drive some of the entry-level stuff to get their fundamentals down pat. And it's on the devs to implement like a licensing system that effectively gates away the the higher powered content for people who can actually handle it. Now, of course, there's going to be people in the comments who cry and say like, well, that's not fun. I don't have time to sit around and unlock things, and I just want to drive all the the cool cars right off the bat. Well, it's like you can't, in this situation, you can't have your cake and eat it too. It's really difficult to advocate for a game that's this giant sandbox when most people jump into the sandbox and are like, I don't know what to do. It's too hard. I tried driving the Indy car. I crashed all the time. I'm not having fun. Maybe we probably should try the other way, but it's,
you're gonna have problems with both. You're just gonna have different problems. Again, nothing that we say on this podcast you have to go out and do, but with me and Austin's background of him doing all this esports sim racing and quality, assurance stuff with simulation software developers, and me being a professional simulator instructor and real life racing instructor, if we tell you you can jump into the fast cars, but you're going to find out that you're not as good as you think you are and have a not fun time, and it's going to ruin your technique long term, and if you're going to be sim racing long term, it would be better to suffer through some slower cars and have less fun, but become actually competent before moving on. It comes from a well-intentioned place. You don't have to do it. You never have to do anything that we recommend. But if you're new and if you're considering it, and I don't think you will be if you're watching this, but you got to learn how to drive slow cars fast, man.
And it's tough because, like, unlike real racing, and we talked about this in the last podcast, like in real life, when you drive like a shitter entry-level car, like it's still fun. It's still fast. You still feel the G-forces. It's still loud and stuff like that. In Sims, that feeling is never conveyed. And like some of the slower cars might actually put you to sleep just if the FFB has been coded in a certain way where the wheel feels heavy and sluggish.
You can watch my onboards from my 120 horsepower Porsche Spec 944 race car and hear me huffing and puffing into the mic like Thomas the Tank Engine Man. Though, like you get a workout driving something with deleted power steering, even if you're only going 60 miles an hour in real life. And that sensation of speed is something a simulator can literally never give you.
Yeah, and that's what kind of deters people from, I think, driving the early content or forcing themselves to kind of play with the early game stuff, because it's very slow. And a lot of these games, especially as graphics have improved, like AC had, a major not a major graphics overhaul, but when AC came out, it was visually leaps and bounds ahead of stuff like R Factor 1, which didn't look very good. R Factor 2 didn't look very good. iRacing itself was dated. So like people kind of want to experience like the good visuals and like the sense of speed and the motion blur and the depth of field stuff that comes with driving a car at 300k. These visual effects are usually not coded to kick in at lower speeds that you'd find in like a spec Miata or an entry-level touring car. So it just makes the game feel very sterile and boring, and even the AI is just not a lot of fun to race at those speeds. So it results in people being like, well, maybe I should, sit down and drive an entry-level car and, dial in my fundamentals for a certain game. But then they go, well, it's really not fun in these games, so they force themselves to try and suffer through, crawling around the track in a Group C car, in a Le Mans prototype, in an F1 car, and they just introduce a different set of problems to themselves. And these problems can be further compounded by the next talking point that I've got written down on my shitty little notepad list here, is that a lot of sim racers don't ask enough questions if a car is too hard to drive, because let's say you actually get through the hoops and you're actually half decent at driving an Indy car, driving a 787B or Group C car, or driving a Formula 1 car, but you still find yourself spinning out anyways. Sometimes it's actually not your fault, which sounds crazy to kind of throw out there into this discussion, because we spent at this point 40 minutes talking about how like, hey, like you should really ease yourself into these games. You should be playing arcade races to start with and then move on to sims. You should be driving only, slower entry-level cars. But some people actually do figure it out relatively quickly. They just run into another roadblock and can't really decipher when it's not their fault. Because one of the biggest secrets...
This is the inverse. This is assuming a situation where somebody has I don't want to say a high level of talent, but a good learning affinity for sim racing, so they get up to pace quickly, but because they haven't studied the theory enough, they are not at the point where they can understand, is this a mismodeling of the sim software versus me making a technique mistake?
And the big secret that I was about to say is that a lot of these sims, not every developer, dots their I's and crosses their T's to the extent that we would like. So just in our experience across multiple sims, across multiple console generations, for lack of a better word, there are cars that ship with horrible default setups that even people like you and I cannot drive. And I think one of the examples I'll give here is again the 787B, the Group C car in Assetto Corsa. Basically, when I started driving this car in a league last winter, about a year ago now, I went into the default set just to kind of figure out, where I should start with. And, like, the differential was backwards. It ran, like, 65 power, which you would never use in an MR car with that much power. The toe was fucked up. The alignment, just in general, the camber settings and all that, were just not what I'd run. Like, the values were just way off. The tire pressures were wrong. It was impressive how bad the car was. And I basically had to, tiptoe around the track when I was driving it. And this is coming from someone who has, basically played, every major racing sim, who has qualified for a couple of esports competitions, who, is good in every racing sim, who's worked for a dev for 4 years, doing QA on this stuff. So, like, it's not like I wasn't experienced.
I don't know, Austin, you said some stuff that people didn't like on the internet once, so I don't think we're going to listen to you.
I've been canceled on Twitter like three or four times, so I guess my opinion doesn't count. But the point is, like, I jumped in, tried to drive the 787B with its default set. I could hardly make a lap, and that's a lot of like newer sim racers probably have run into that problem and just don't realize it. So, like, for example, for me, for the 787B, I had to go into, and I don't even know if this violates NDA or not, but like shit, like for building the IndyCar in one of the Project Cars games, we had setup data from, I believe, their Schmidt-Peterson Motorsport. So we had James Hinchcliffe's IndyCar setup. So I took those values, his diff settings, his like spring rates, his like shock package, and threw it into the 787B because I'm like, well, it's kind of a downforce car, and it fixed the car. It went from being this uncontrollable death trap where you'd be in a league and like see people in front of you spinning out off the corner by themselves in like a medium speed corner, to just like, it was one of the easiest cars I'd ever driven. And like, I gave the setup to my buddy and he went from finishing like 15th to like 3rd within a week. Yeah. Just because the default set was that bad. And the issue is that because people are new at these games and don't know what they don't know, a lot of them don't have the heart to ask, like, hey, is this car actually okay? Because they might have a friend in their Discord group or their TeamSpeak who's actually like, no, this car is not okay. The default set sucks. Here's the setup I use, and it just immediately fixes the car.
Yeah, so be inquisitive. This is basically a long way of saying the simulator could get something wrong. It could be a bad car or car mod, especially if it's a simulator that has modded content available. It could literally be something stolen that has total guesswork physics, like Sim Dream Development, the notorious car model thieves from Assetto Corsa, right?
Yep.
And people buy their stuff not realizing that it's stolen and not knowing it's any better. So what we're saying in a roundabout way is, if something feels wrong or you see something that doesn't seem right, say something. If you see something, say something. Hey, does the fact that this act this way, is that actually realistic? And you might get the answer of, dude, you're brand new. You can't drive the turbo McLaren MP45 F1 car that Ayrton Senna won the 88 World Championship in. You dummy. That's your fault 100%. Yes, it does handle like that. But there might be situations in which you learn, oh, okay, maybe something's going on that's incorrect here, or the sim gets something wrong, right? So don't just listen to us. Don't just take our word for it. Go through and ask questions. Ask questions. When you're new, you should be always asking questions. If you're ever unsure about anything, a driving technique, if a car handles the right way, if you want to find somewhere to race, if you want a beginner's league, like hop into my Discord and ask me where to race, and I'll help you get set up on sim racing system, or I'll send you to the 9 p.m. Eastern time Monday night league with the JG1 Flight Sim Squadron that I race in, because we're super welcoming to beginners. If I don't know where to race, what car to start driving, where to go to do something, if this feels correct or not, or if there's a way to metagame this car to make it go faster, ask questions. Generally speaking, as me and Austin have mentioned in the previous podcast, as long as you're in the right place with the right people, they're not going to be cagey about giving you advice or helpful information. Yep. And if they are, get the fuck out of there and go race somewhere else ASAP.
Yeah, and it's really impressive, like, when we talk about cars that are just unrelentlessly difficult to drive. This is not just a one-off car in a one-off game. I mean, I could throw out like 5 or 6 examples of cars just like being busted, and the community genuinely not knowing that like it wasn't their fault that they were spinning out. Like, there was a car back in the iRacing old tire model days. I believe it was like the old Nationwide Impala, like the Gen 4 stock car on iRacing.
Oh God, there was Twisted Sister B spec.
So someone went into the telemetry and found out that one of the rear tires wasn't touching the ground. Yeah. So, like, a new person to sim racing would be like, wow, I just really suck at NASCAR. But in reality, everyone was spinning because, like, the car was broken. Or we're going to run the URD IndyCar mod tonight for one of the SRS races, and I believe it's like a free mod by a really good payware team. But the default setup, the tow is just 0. Usually you run, like, a little bit of a negative value in the front and a positive in the rear. But both ends of the car are at 0, so as you go through the center of the corner, the car just like washes out on you and just like self-spin. So like even I'm like white-knuckling the wheel through the corner, and I'm good at this, and it's just ridiculous, but we have to deal with it because it's a fixed setup series. Another car, the Lotus 98T in AC. The car is a ground effects car, but the default set doesn't have the car low enough to the ground for it to work. So a lot of the grip that the car had mid-corner in real life that made the car basically on rails, by default isn't there. So if you were just take like shakedown laps with the default set with it, you'd be like, this is a piece of shit to drive, when in reality, like, well, the gearing's fucked up. They didn't account for, the crazy amounts of turbo boosts in higher RPMs at lower gear, so they basically set you up for failure there. And the ride heights they didn't even set properly, so like the car is generating half the downforce it needs to. There are little quirks like this across every single game and almost every car. So please, like, if you're in the situation where you're like, okay, I think I'm actually, kind of competent at this track. Let's say you get pretty good at Laguna Seca, and you're still, like, wrecking every couple of corners or, like, every other lap. Don't just be like, wow, maybe I suck at this game. Genuinely start asking questions, because, like, a lot of developers, again, don't dot their I's and cross their T's, and we've had to unfuck a fair bit of cars just in the setup menu alone, because like the default set was so bad.
Yeah, ask questions. It very well could be your fault, but it also very well couldn't be. And both are legitimate, and be prepared for either answer. It might be your fault. You might suck, and it might not be your fault. You might not suck, and both of those are fine.
Do you remember any particular cars on your end where you drove it and you're just like, this is fucked up? Because I mean, like I was able to rattle off a few off the top of my head, but I'm curious because you played slightly different games than I have, and have different tastes
when
than
the
me.
when the new tire model first came out for the Legends car in iRacing.
Oh my god!
I still don't think that the Legends car is accurate to this day, and it's got a problem. Now the Assetto Corsa mod for it, I actually think is way better, but that's a car that's naturally super stupid hard to drive, so that also might not be something that a beginner should be driving. But that car was broken.
Yeah, I've heard that too in real life, where it's like I've heard it was more technical than a Sportsman late model, and how you had to like roll into the corner on dirt.
It's more technical than a super late model. I think that if you can drive a Legends car at like a national level, you can actually probably drive a second or third tier NASCAR Pro truck or support series car. No problem. Genuinely, I think they're that hard to drive, or something like a tube frame Trans Am car, depending on the class and how much power it has. Like I bet you, I've seen them race a lot. I bet you I could race a Trans Am 2 car to a decently competitive finish.
That sounds about right,
because it would handle so close to my Legends car. Right, tube frame, weld diff, shocks on all four corners. Right, McPherson struts on all four corners, but with a solid rear axle. Decently fat tires for the weight. Not a huge amount of power, but still some. I bet you I could probably race a Trans Am 2 car pretty competitively, because it would probably just handle like a Legends car.
So Legends car and iRacing, yeah, that was every tire model. It just seemed like that thing wanted to kill you, which was just insane. Because like kids race,
it doesn't handle like that in real life. You can drive it in a slide on the cushion. Now the weird thing is the dirt version of the Legends car actually does handle realistically, but the asphalt one is scuffed. I don't know. That's why.
Amazing. Anything else from the road side, whether it be iRacing or AC or whatever, just like bad
the Lotus
default
49.
sets.
Just about every big sim, especially if it allows mods, has the Lotus 49. Again, when the new tire model came out, that was scuffed and way too hard on iRacing. They recently just repatched it, and I tried it, and it's way better now.
The Lotus 49, when it first shipped on iRacing, that was, what was that, summer 2013? That was ridiculous.
Winter 2012, spring 2013, I think. Yeah.
I have like PTSD from that. It was so bad. Like there would be what they would show in the trailer of just like a dude. I think they put out like either Dave Kamer or John Henry. It's probably Dave Kamer driving a lap of the ring and just talking about the history of GPL. And it looked like the car was fine. And then everyone drove it and we're like, "What the fuck was this?" Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember that. It was a huge problem. That was a really bad one. And again, ACs has a problem, but it's a default setup issue, in my opinion.
What is it, by the way? Because like everyone runs that car. I think there's a couple achievements tied to it too.
I think it's a combination of gear ratios and default spring settings and ride heights.
Okay.
It wants to be lower than it is by default. The tire pressures on pretty much all the Kunos default contact cars for AC are not good out of the box, especially if you're a fast driver.
Yep, I've noticed that.
The tire pressures need adjustment. The gear ratio spacings are far too long for how peaky the torque curve is. It needs like 30 or 40 kilometer an hour, 20 mile an hour gear ratio spacings with a super long first gear, and it doesn't have that. It needs more diff lock on basically both drive and coast because it's an old vintage car, so the differential locking force is super weak.
Okay.
And then it needs way stiffer rear springs so that it can drive through the corner with the back with the throttle on in a slide without the back coming up under braking too much and oversteering into the corner. Which is the same problem a lot of cars, like older cars that oversteer off throttle like that have. You need to stiffen them out to the maximum of what the setup allows just so that the weight doesn't transfer forward to back too much because you drive that car entirely with your feet. Yeah, other than that, it's nothing too major. From what
it seems like the Lotus
remember.
49's been really hard to get right in Sims, because like even dating back to Grand Prix Legends, a lot of the reasons people found that game hard back in the day, and I don't think I've ever like spoken about this in like an isolated video, but the default sets in GPL for like version 1.0 actually shipped with the car bottoming out. So a lot of like the phantom GPL spins that like us as kids would have to deal with weren't because we were bad, but because like the car would just bottom out and just skid, and we'd be like, what the fuck happened? But there was no telemetry back then, There was no like intense setup guides. You'd really have to dig on like GeoCities for like a setup tutorial. So people would just go into a corner and just wreck like instantly, and they'd be like, "What the fuck happened?" And again, FFB wasn't a big thing back then. Half people didn't even have wheels, so you'd go into like a sort of banked corner. The car would compress, and people would have no idea what the fuck happened. They would just be backwards in the wall. So like this has been a common problem in racing sims. So it's really important to ask, because something might actually be broken. And it's just like the nature of these devs. These devs aren't EA Sports or Codemasters where they have like a shit ton of money and time and resources to throw out things. Like a lot of these dev teams started out as like modding groups. So like there is that general lack of polish that comes with like a mod team who made it big and now have a development contract. Because like some cars, man, they just don't ship well. Do you remember anything modern in AC that's just like really not good?
As in modern car, or was like released recently, or yes?
Both. Just anything. Because this will kind of give people some ballpark. Like if they've driven these cars and they've been like, oh yeah, like I remember driving the Lotus 49 and I didn't really get it,
I think that the default setup on pretty much all the modern race cars sucks. There's huge balance of performance problems between Assetto Corsa's GT3 cars. So everybody jumps into GT3 cars really quickly and gets in a GT3 car league. There's GT3 cars that are not competitive. The Ferrari 488 is down on a straight line and like by like 20 miles an hour to all the other GT3 cars.
That was also an issue in iRacing too. Guys would do like weekly comparison videos and show you that like, okay, there's one meta car for this track because it's just not balanced correctly.
Yeah, that's consistently an issue across pretty much all sims. It's happening with ACC right now too, where the Bentley is just destroying everything else.
Yep. Oh man, I ran in an ACC league last year, I think it was, and I didn't know there was any meta at all, so I picked the Audi, and some dude just raped me, like straight up raped me in a Bentley, and I'm like, what's happening?
Yeah. It happens with pretty much everything. R Factor 2, there's also a meta. I did a decently high-end GT3 league only one or two times, and I chose the Corvette GT3 car because they're one of the only people that has the old front-engine C7 Corvette GT3 car.
Yep,
and I really liked it. It was super fun to drive, and one of the people was like, I don't know how you got second at Hungaroring your first time in our league and qualified. I had to qualify in because it had like 30 people and only 28 slots or something.
Yep.
And you know me, I'm me, and I'll be like, hi, I'm new to this sim, blah, 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 and like play it down a bit. And they were like, this is like an esports league, right? And I'm like, I actually didn't know that. But there was a bunch of like semi-pro level drivers in it. And they're like, you should not have finished that high with the Corvette. It's horrible. It's like not meta at all. And I'm like, but don't you? Oh, okay, sure. Sweet. There, to a certain extent, you can drive around it, but everything has been broken at some point.
Yeah, what was the meta in R Factor 2? Isn't it like lowest possible camber values?
Lowest possible camber values, lowest possible tire pressures, because the tire pressures make the tires heat.
Yep.
And that tire model is like the opposite of Assetto, where Assetto doesn't really care about temperature, but it cares a lot about pressure. It's the opposite for that. You can make the tires as flat as possible, just so that they don't build as much air volume and therefore not as much heat, and then you just try to keep the tires cool throughout the lap. It's kind of like that. Kind of iRacing style, almost.
Yep. And again, if people don't know that, they would, even if you're new sim racer or new-ish sim racer, had a bit of background setup knowledge coming from like Forza or stuff like that.
Yeah, even if you set up a car like you would in real life and you don't know the metagame trick for whatever simulation software you're using, you're just not going to do well.
Yeah, or it'll handle really fucked up.
Or it'll handle super weird, which is why a lot of my coaching that I give to students revolves around specific techniques on a baseline setup, just so that we know where everybody's at.
That makes sense.
Because as long as you can drive the car fast, if you later figure out how to metagame it and fix it and make it artificially quicker, you'll go quicker whether your racing technique is good or not. So if we fix the technique and then you learn how to do the metagame trick for the setup later, you can build the meta of going fast in the sim on top of being able to drive the car with a good real life driving technique.
Here's a good question. Have you ever been asked the inverse of what we just talked about, where was there a car that was actually really good out of the box and you're just like, wow, this is awesome, and you saw everyone on the forums whine and complain and say it was broken?
For that,
I got one example in my head. I'm just trying to see if you could pull out one out of your ass here.
I'm thinking the touring car from iRacing, the Audi TCR car.
Okay, the newer one?
I thought that was... Yeah, I thought that was pretty close to some of the kit high-power front-engine, front-wheel drive touring cars I've driven in real life, and people hated it.
Now, why did they hate it? What was their
because they
complaint?
said it was unrealistically oversteery and that the rear brakes would lock too easy and punish you too hard if you made a mistake. And I don't know about you, but a 300 to 400 foot-pound of torque front-engine, front-engine, front-wheel drive touring car is literally designed to drag the ass around the whole corner.
Yeah.
So if you don't have the car perfectly straight when you start braking, it's cornering on the brakes. It's set up to turn that way, right? And you're around. And I remember actually, my boss at a sim racing school I made a course on how to drive that car for, was recording some positive and negative examples of a technique for me. He would normally do the negative example, I would do the positive example, right?
Yep.
And he was like, man, I can't get a good take. I keep spinning into this downhill right-hander. It was the second chicane. The second chicane of the lap at Olton Park full course. You know, there's the one you go through like the right, the long left, and then the big straight, and then there's the chicane out of the first hairpin, and then when you come down the hill, there's the chicane before the fast right-hander.
Yeah, the fast right-hander everyone dies at.
Right. He kept basically pointing the nose of the car. He would be too far to the center line of the track because he was scared of the track edge because of the oversteer.
Yep.
And then he would point the nose to the left and then brake, and then he would spin left into the wall. He was like, why am I spinning? I'm going in a straight line. And I'm like, look at your inputs. And he had like 10 degrees of steering into the left, and that's all it took, and he would spin around. And people kept complaining about that constantly on iRacing about being unrealistic. And it's like, no, if you take a car that has 300 horsepower and is front wheel drive, they're going to put all the aero on the front and none of the aero on the back and put completely neutral toe on the rear tires and tow out the front tires a ton and throw all the camber in the front and just make the car drive off the front tires. If you have any steering input in and then start braking, the car wants to loop around into a spin because it's set up the exact opposite way of a front engine rear wheel drive car.
Hell, I've seen that in front-wheel drive oval racing where like the Cavaliers are notoriously touchy on brakes because once you start doing the alignment tricks that come with front-wheel drive oval racing, if your wheel isn't dead center, the car just like snaps. I've seen people wreck in practice following me just because they would try and use
you drive those cars 100% off your feet with the steering wheel almost totally flat, basically.
No, and you're absolutely right. Like if my wheel wasn't centered going into the corner and I wasn't trail braking it and just sending it with the brake, I would be dead. And I would get people would tell me that like, hey, someone wrecked behind you in practice because they tried to follow you and didn't have your line down pat exactly and just backed it into the wall. And I'm like, yeah, like these cars are really fucking edgy. And it's interesting people like make those complaints on the forums, and it just kind of shows you how unintelligent like the average sim racer is, which kind of circles back to a point that like don't just like go on Reddit and like take people's advice on sim racing,
right?
Because like here iRacing actually did a really good job of modeling the Audi TCR car correctly and getting all of its unique quirks right, and people were complaining that it was too unrealistic and too edgy when actually that was right. And this happened a couple times too. And this would have been a bit before your time because you're a bit younger. But 2011, when they first rolled out the new tire model on like a couple of cars just across the whole sim, one of them was the 2011 nationwide car tomorrow. It would have been like the Impala at the time, the Impala B car, the old brick. It just looks like a piece of shit. But there was 3 or 4 weeks in 2011 where like the very first iteration of the new tire model, the car was actually fairly tight to drive, and you had to nurse the right front tire. And a lot of people complained that it was unrealistic and it didn't allow them to drive, with the ass end hanging out off the corner. And it resulted in a lot of like weird, like online race results because like guys who were normally mid-pack drivers but were fans of NASCAR and really paid attention to like what the commentators would talk about during the race, all had picked up how to save their right front tire just from being fans of the sport and like understanding the theory behind oval track racing, and were starting to just destroy like esports guys and all of like the random like amateur drivers, like late model guys or like truck series guys who were like religiously playing iRacing because that's what you did back in the day, were like destroying like the esports drivers on a regular basis, and you had like the community basically divided between people with track experience saying like, hey, this is like really, really good, and like you can manage your tires accurately during a run, and like everything I do in my real car works, versus like the esports tryhards and like basically the fanboys of the game being like, I don't know why, but it's wrong and it doesn't handle like slidey and on the edge like NASCAR 03, so please change it. And that kind of kicked off like years worth of iRacing just like fudging the tire model to try and appease both groups, which resulted in cars that didn't handle anything realistically, which was just messy, you know? So it's happened multiple times. Like, it's a very real thing in sim racing where like a car can be modeled massively inaccurate, or on the flip side, the car is actually modeled accurate, but people hate it anyway. So please, like, if you're in that situation, please ask questions to someone who's been around a bit longer than you and try and figure out things for yourself and get, proper answers on that. Because, like, you might not be the problem,
And if you've got no frame of reference, there's really no way to tell, especially if you're super new.
Yeah.
Don't go on really opinionated forums like Reddit or Twitter or anything like that. Get into a league that has some reputable fast drivers or on a public race booking system where people are actually quick, like a sim racing system or a World Sim Series or, the iRacing competitive scene. Go where the people who are actually good and fast are and ask questions. And if a whole bunch of people are giving you different answers, it's probably because it's a controversial topic, and don't stick to one thing. Just do what works best for you.
Well, I think
anything else?
I think we burned through my page of notes here. Like that's pretty much everything. I mean, we could probably go into theory in a bit more detail in another episode. And if you guys really want that, like, sure, let's all go for it. We'll do a full episode on that topic because I think it is worthwhile to break down.
I could talk about beginner
habits.
racing mistakes specifically for hours. And actually, today we haven't mentioned it, but we haven't mentioned like starting with either too much or too little gear, and what we think like the minimum amount of gear for sim racing would be. And we could leave that out if you want, or just do it quick, because I'm pretty much just going to say buy a Thrustmaster T300 or a Logitech G920.
Gear is probably another episode.
Yeah, you're right. We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Sim Racing Rejects podcast. If you want to support us, don't forget to subscribe and like. And if you want some good racing with a good active community of intelligent people to guide you towards getting better and avoid beginner mistakes, I would highly suggest coming to the Sim Racing System series that me and Austin regularly race in on Assetto Corsa, various time slots, various days. Either one of us could help you get set up with that if you send us an inquiry on my Roundel Racing Discord. Links in the description, or come to the JG1 Racing Team Beginner Series on Monday nights. Don't forget that the episodes are every 2 weeks on Monday. We will see you next time. Don't let anybody open your mouth and cough down your throat.